Thank you all for having me. This is a real honor to be here, and I'm very excited to hear the poems. The ones that I just heard were wonderful, and so I'll be quite excited to hear those. So to begin with, I want to make sure that everyone understands my process, and these are photographically based. And what I'm doing is I'm taking the darkroom paper out of the box, turning on the room lights, and then spreading the chemistry over the paper. So each piece is developing while it's exposing, and there isn't a camera, and there isn't a negative, and it's not a photograph of anything. Each is a one of a kind. And really the nature of this work is really letting go of control over the final piece, because you have no way of knowing what you're going to get. You know, you don't know what colors are going to emerge, you don't know what shapes are going to emerge. There's no way to tell. And even what you thought might be a dense region of color could end up being an undeveloped white spot in the end. And so the work is very much about giving yourself over to the process and just allowing it to emerge. Which is funny because there's an old school philosophy that there are no surprises in the darkroom, that you achieve exactly the print that you intended to make, and this goes to the beat of a different drummer, I have to say. But that does bring me to one point, which is that I have never seen this work as challenging the traditional definition of a photograph. To me, such a thing is a little bit worn out in the arts. It's sort of the idea of saying don't be cliche, which sort of is the biggest cliche of modern art. You know, it's a lot like my brother used to say, where he'd say, you're an individual just like everyone else. So I think that's the mentality that we have to look beyond in the arts at this point in time. And so alchemy forms the basis of this work, as you've heard in some of the prior comments. And it would be easy to say that such a thing is just sort of primitive chemistry or some of these things. But alchemy was always a much more poetic and divine pursuit. It was really focused on the metaphysical rather than the physical. And Carl Jung, the Swiss psychologist, spent a great deal of time with three subjects in particular: religion, mythology, and alchemy. And I think it's fair to say that two things that he saw in all three were a sense of transformation and a desire to achieve a certain superhuman state. And I'll tell you, there are times in the darkroom where I just feel fired up, where you just feel the juices flowing, and by your hands these materials just transform before you. And alchemists would typically speak of their work in very veiled terms. They might say something like, the gold can't be achieved until the king and queen join hands. These sorts of very poetic allusions to things like that. And Jung theorized that as men and women, we each have either the anima or the animus. And these were, the anima is the feminine side of the masculine psyche, the animus, the masculine side of the female psyche. And it was Jung's thought that when we bring these things together, we begin to achieve a more complete self. And so to me, when I look at these works, the line and the color really sort of pull those elements together for me. There's something bold and meditative at the same time, and a real coalescence of opposites. So the large print in the back there is part of a series called the epic prints. And an epic is a very large expanse of time. Or you could think of the related narrative term epic, meaning something grand or adventuresome. And there's one line in Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, where James Joyce, who's famous for the stream of consciousness style, where there's one point where he writes, the character sort of wakes up and he writes, was it a moment of enchantment only, or long hours and days and years and ages? So I leave works like that as large unmounted prints because I want to put forward the most direct and natural photographic object I can, something a little bit raw. And I think in the age of digital natives, I think it's actually a little bit important to put forward something, say, a little more material or tactile, even though I don't really want people touching them. But I say of myself that I'm not a digital native. I'm an analog expatriate. I don't do the Netflix. I order my movies from the library. But moving on. So I mentioned before that these are not photographs of anything. And to me, the goal is really to create an energetic, ethereal space. A former professor of mine saw these, and she said that they're a mindscape rather than a landscape. That they really preferred a conceptual space. But on that note, there's one point that I want to advance concerning conceptual art. And I've hung around education a little bit. And I have to ask, when we're increasingly focused on standardized testing, are we teaching our society to think creatively? No. But really, we want creative thinkers. We give a lot of lip service to that. But how are we going to encourage kids to think outside the box when the point of the test is to fill in the box? So that's my 2 cents on education. I have to put that out there. But I was sharing these works with a mentor recently, and she started to talk about the Nocturnes by James Whistler. And Whistler may have gotten the title from Chopin, who composed a number of short works in this genre of nocturne, which was a style that was really evocative of the night. It really suggested something deeply connected to the night itself, and perhaps the calm or the tranquility or the solitude that can occur at that time of day. When I work, I typically work through the night and sometimes clean up at 5 or 6 in the morning. So in that way, these pieces are really connected to those deep hours of the night and the sort of solitude or the Dionysian mentality that can come about at that time of day. Although for me, instead of Chopin, No Quarter Live by Led Zeppelin is the anthem of the darkroom. But operating at a certain time of day or with a certain mentality really brings me to another point, which is that I see this method of working in the darkroom as really a photographic ceremony. And if you think about what separates a ceremony from day-to-day activities, what it really comes down to is that any ritual involves a dignified series of acts whereby one status is left behind and a new status is adopted. You think of a wedding or bar mitzvah or commencement. And here the photographic paper goes from nothing, and through this process it becomes something. But to expand on that for just a bit, Victor Turner was an anthropologist who studied ceremony, and he was most interested in the middle phase, what was called the liminal phase of ceremony. And this was the middle portion, where the old had been left behind, but the new had not yet been achieved. And the thing is that in this liminality, one is sort of without identity. Some of the things Turner studied were tribal rituals that lasted several days. So in that state, one is sort of without a solid identity. And so in that way, all things become possible. Some people will look at these images and they might see a tree, they might see a waterfall, a face, a figure, what have you. But the imagery never really solidifies into a solid photograph of something. And so the liminal is this constant state of flux and possibility. But when we talk about photographic materials, we have to understand that they're always in a state of change. Even photographs housed in a museum, it will eventually begin to fade in response to light. But the change in art is a funny thing because we fight it very, very hard. And photography is actually more susceptible to this than most mediums. But how beautiful are the Greek bronzes with that green patina? And how beautiful are the Roman marbles as these pristine white objects? But that's not how these things were in their original state or context. But both of those things change over time. So I look at it a little bit differently, and I say that these works are forever within the photographic process. They are forever developing and transforming. Now, this might not begin for another 20 or 40 years or so, So it's sort of a long ephemeral, if you will, but that becomes part of the work. And so the one point I want to end on, and I do have to admit that I thought of this about a year after this work was made, but I think you can still see it at play. If someone were to ask me what my greatest influence is as an artist, my answer, and I'm serious when I say this, my answer would have to be Led Zeppelin. It really would. And I'm Roland Barthes and some of these other thinkers, I'm afraid they're going to have to take a back seat. But I say Zeppelin because if you take something like Kashmir, in word and riff, to me, there's a real combination of the poetic and the badass. I could put that in more academic terms, but I really don't see the need. But the thing is, to have something that really combines those two things, that's not an aesthetic I've really come across anywhere else. We can all think of things that fall on either side of that equation, but to come up with something that's intelligent and charismatic, that's a little bit more unique to me, and that's something I seek to emulate in my imagery.